Thank you for joining us. I'm TJ. I'm the Director of Communications and Program Operations for the Elections Group. For those of you who are joining for the first time, the Elections Group is a nonpartisan election administration consulting firm that partners with state and local election officials to implement new programs or improve processes for voters and other stakeholders. We provide guidance, resources, and direct management support for states and local jurisdictions. And our team, interestingly, is made up of all former election officials from across the United States. Today's conversation is about a really important topic, election observation, and we're very fortunate to have a number of experts with us who are going to be speaking about that topic. As many of you, whether you're election officials or advocates or just interested parties, I think we all understand that it's up to election officials and observers of all sorts to work together to make transparent opportunities happen within election administrations or election administration. Oftentimes, these groups are seen as adversaries, but in truth, their distinct roles should and could be mutually supportive across many contexts. So we have three different pillars that we focus our observation work this year on. This webinar today is going to focus on the first pillar, which is managing and providing meaningful opportunities for observation. I'm really pleased today to have three different experts with us to delve into this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, and we'll begin with Jasleen.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Jasleen Singh, and I'm a voting rights attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice. And I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to be talking, sort of giving you a broad overview of federal laws and policies that govern election observers.
Excellent. We'll move to Carmen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Carmen Lopez. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I work on democracy and voting and elections nationally in my role as president of CL Strategies. I'm leading on behalf of the Carter Center in New Mexico, a statewide nonpartisan election observation effort that will occur in half of precincts in all 33 counties in New Mexico, and have been doing that for many, many months. And we're now hitting the ground running. So I'm here in that capacity, and I look forward to sharing with you about that.
Excellent. And last but not least, Roki, we'll go to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roki Suleman. I'm a consultant with the Carter Center. I'm previously a former elections administrator in several states in the United States. Plus, I've also worked on 26 international election observation missions, from everything from a core team member analyzing the election all the way to a short-term observer. So we want to talk to you about how we're taking our experiences as international monitors and translating that to the United States.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for those introductions. We're going to actually jump right into some presentations. First from Jasleen on their work at the Brennan Center. So why don't you take it away?
Thank you. So as I said, I work with the at the Brennan Center, and the Brennan Center itself is a multifaceted, nonpartisan advocacy organization. It's part think tank, part communications hub, part law firm. And recently, to offer some guidance on how folks can become election observers, what they can do while they're serving as an election observer, and what election workers can do to prevent observers from disrupting the voting process, Brennan Center published a series of resources that provide that overview of federal and state laws that serve as guardrails against any disruption to the voting process or any intimidation that could come from election observers. I'm going to quickly share my screen to just show you what that looks like. But this will be in sort of the after webinar email that you get from our friends at the election group. But I wanted to point out that this resource it provides an overview, but it really focuses on 10 states where the risk of disruption is especially high based on the volume of false allegations and anti-voter activity over the past few years that we've seen. So Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Just wanted to give you a sense of what that looked like. So I want to be clear, election observers help to ensure transparency and public trust in our elections, but they can also disrupt the voting or counting process, intimidate voters, and misunderstand or mischaracterize what they observe, and potentially offer inaccurate or potentially inflammatory accounts of what they've seen. And we've heard accounts of this happening in both the 2020 and 2022 elections. And so we've seen that some groups saw this not as a problem, but as an opportunity, pledging to recruit and train tens of thousands of election observers, sometimes suggesting that election observers push the boundaries of acceptable conduct. We've seen several states, including Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, that have recently enacted laws to expand the scope of observer access while limiting the circumstances under which election workers may constrain or remove disruptive observers. And as a result, 2024 may see a higher risk of observer abuse. I want to level set a bit as I get into sort of what the guides cover. Federal law is clear that intimidating voters is illegal. It's no matter who is doing it, whether the person intended their actions to intimidate is irrelevant if they have the effect of intimidating voters. And these protections also extend to anyone urging or aiding others to vote, which could include election workers. And these protections apply throughout the election life cycle, including registering to vote, assisting voters, casting a ballot, counting ballots, certifying the results. And so just want to offer that as a general overview and something that applies to observers and anyone who is part of the elections process or interacting with voters. So turning to the guides, each state has a process for how someone can become an election observer. And I'm not going to be going into every single state here, but I do want to go over some common policies that govern who can become an election observer and how. And so states may require election observers to be a registered voter, and sometimes more specifically, a registered voter in the same county that the observer plans to serve. States may limit how many observers can be present at any given time at a polling location. For example, in Texas, no more than 2 poll watchers from each political party can be present, and in Arizona, it's only 1 observer per location. And as I'm speaking, I'm realizing I should caveat that I'm using the word election observers, but that term is also sort of used interchangeably and can be used interchangeably with poll watcher. It sort of depends on state law and sometimes just how colloquially people refer to observers. So moving on, states may also require that election observers be appointed by a political party or a candidate in order to serve, so they're constrained by who appoints them. States may require election observers to register with the county beforehand and obtain a certificate with the name of the candidate and political party they represent, or they may need to otherwise sign into a polling location, so there's some sort of record that they were there. Many states require poll watchers to take an oath to perform their duties. And some states require observers to wear a badge identifying themselves as a poll watcher. Some states, like Texas and Georgia, also require poll watchers to undergo a training prior to serving. And states may also have different policies that apply to election observers at a polling location versus a counting station. And they may have differing policies and around how someone can become an observer and how many people are allowed at those different places. So moving on, I want to turn to common guardrails that we've seen for what an election observer can actually do at a polling location. As I stated earlier, intimidating voters or election officials is illegal across the nation. But in addition to that, many states explicitly provide that observers should not disrupt the elections process. Some states also allow watchers to view from only a designated observation area. Every state also limits campaigning and political activity, commonly known as electioneering, within a buffer zone around a polling place to mitigate the risk of intimidation and harassment. Most states strictly limit what so that covers electioneering. In some states, election observers can also challenge a voter's eligibility, but there are constraints on when and how that can happen. So for example, in Texas, poll watchers can't challenge a voter's eligibility during early voting or election day. But in other states, observers can directly lodge challenges with the election workers on site if they have a sufficient amount of evidence to lodge that challenge. And different states have different thresholds for what that evidentiary standard of proof needs to be to lodge a challenge. Many states also prohibit election observers from talking or interacting with voters, using photography or video while they're observing, or even using their cell phones while they're observing. And finally, I want to turn briefly to talk about what poll workers can do to ensure that election observers are not intimidating voters or otherwise disrupting elections. So many states authorize election workers to remove poll watchers who are abusing the rules or intimidating voters. And if an observer refuses to leave, election workers are authorized to request assistance of law enforcement to remove the observer. Election workers should generally use their best judgment on doing so, as the presence of law enforcement itself can have an intimidating effect on voters. And in some states, violating the laws that pertain to election observers may also subject them to criminal penalties. That sort of concludes the broad overview of common guardrails that I wanted to cover for you today. I'd encourage folks to take a look at the explainers when they're sent over. They're obviously very useful for those 10 states that I mentioned, but even taking a look at a few will provide some guidance on how laws and state policies cover a whole host of actions when it comes to election observers. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jasleen. I think really importantly, my former experience as an election official showed just how important it was for election officials to understand what those guardrails were and to be able to communicate them succinctly. Very seldom did you ever have anybody who walked up to those guardrails or went over them. But I think as a matter of course, just knowing what they were, both for the observer but also for the election official, it was really invaluable. So we will move on to Carmen and Roki from the Carter Center. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, TJ. I appreciate it. I'm going to start first. I'm going to share my screen and talk about what the Carter Center is doing. The Carter Center, election observation, we're bringing an international practice to the United States. Why are we doing this? The Carter Center is guided by the principles of our founders, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. We're founded in partnership with Emory University when we have a fundamental commitment to human rights and the alleviation of human suffering. The Carter Center seeks to prevent and resolve all kinds of conflict and enhance freedom, democracy, and mental health. The Carter Center, in its history, has conducted 124 full and limited observation missions around the world in 40 countries and 3 Native American nations. We've also done 17 expert missions in 15 countries. And as I stated earlier, I have experience with 26 missions in, I believe, 19 countries. So let me move on here. Why election observation in the United States? We want to do this because election observation can lead to increased confidence and transparency in elections. We want to provide a foundation of data that can support reforms when warranted. We also want to speak to the process of the election, not the outcome. We're not concerned about the outcome as much as we are concerned about whether the process is transparent and represents the will of the people. We also want to provide a needed third-party voice in a space that's otherwise dominated by political parties and the media. sometimes the voices of regular citizens are just drowned out. So we're trying to create a capacity for that to change. Challenges, decentralization. There's no central election administration in the United States. As we all are aware, elections are administered in 50 states and the District of Columbia, as well as the several territories. There's a different legal framework. As Jasleen was saying, some states allow for observation in varying capacities, others do not. Also, one of the challenges that we're facing with this is that elections administrators' previous experience with observers are more likely to have been partisan observers, not citizen observers. And the partisan observers often participate in gotcha exercises, which can create a mistrust of what a nonpartisanship election mission would actually look like. How do we overcome these challenges? Strategy and response. What we're doing now is we're growing cross-partisan relationships in jurisdictions. We're trying to find like-minded people who, while they may disagree politically, share a desire to increase electoral trust. We're cultivating relationships with elections administrators. We're operating in states with clear legal openings and past precedent of independent observations. And we're adapting our observation methodology to the local election conditions. Our objectives, the Carter Center's objectives in this is to increase the public trust in elections. Public trust, unfortunately, has eroded in elections over the past several years. We want to demonstrate with objective data that while our elections are well conducted and point out any potential deficiencies if and when they occur. We want to communicate to elections officials about our operation and our methodology. We want to work with folks so that elections officials trust who we are when we're coming in. We're also seeking to build capacity among citizen groups for individual observation missions. What we'd like to do is find these people and build cross-partisan relationships to allow them to stand up their own election observation missions, be it at a local level in a county or potentially in a statewide level. And we also want to adapt the observation methodology to the electoral geography. Each election is operated differently in each of the individual states. So we want to tell people how to adapt what a form would look like, what your methodology should look like for early voting, absentee voting, election day voting, and how to create all of these options independently for your own organization. The Carter Center is currently assisting with 3 observations in the United States. We have the Montana Election Observation Mission, the Observe New Mexico Elections, and we're doing a mission in Fulton County in a combined effort with another monitoring group to monitor the entire process in Fulton County. So now what I'd like to do is turn over to Carmen Lopez, who is leading our observation mission in New Mexico, and let her talk about how those folks are working with local elections officials and getting the mission off the ground. So Carmen.
Thank you, Roki. Hi, everyone. My name is Carmen Lopez again. I'd like to address partisan and nonpartisan observers and then talk about what role our Observe New Mexico Elections is playing in elections in New Mexico this year. And I will also address what I see as are some of the best practices, both in law and then as we engage directly with election officials. And I do this because the law in New Mexico is particularly strong as relates to setting guardrails around elections. Our Secretary of State and our county clerks have done an extraordinary job of building an election system in New Mexico that has been acknowledged nationally and internationally. And they are the only state that I am aware of in the US that has protections and standing for nonpartisan observers. Every state has partisan observers, and every state has observers that show up to the polls to watch what's happening with their particular constituency base. So, for example, there are disability rights advocates who observe in polls to make sure that people have the access that the law requires, or there are people who work on language access issues that make sure that ballots are in fact provided or that translation is provided consistent with state or federal law. We, as nonpartisan observers, play a role that is distinct from both of those other observer roles. We are not present in elections in order to advocate for particular sets of voters or to intervene in election practices in any way. We are present in the election processes in order to observe. We send folks out with checklists that follow state law, and they walk through that checklist and they observe what happens and what doesn't, and then they report back. And they have a non-interference, non-engagement, just the facts related role in New Mexico elections. They all adhere to the Secretary of State's legal requirements that they participate in a training, that they register with the state. And then we at the Carter Center and at Observe New Mexico Elections also have our own requirements for observers. So we train each of the observers in the practices and the laws associated with that particular election process. For example, certifying machines, or poll worker training, or observing early voting, or observing election day voting. And so those folks are prepared. We also prepare them in terms of their orientation of how they walk into the election space. Again, around non-interference, around observations, and around just the facts reporting. And then I most importantly want to talk about the way in which we have interacted with election officials in the lead up to this election. So we have hired 33 county coordinators, one for each of our counties, and then 6 regional coordinators within the state. Those folks have interacted with every county clerk in the state, and let them know that that we want to leave the communication open. So if there are any problems with our observers, we want to know immediately. If there are any concerns that any of those election officials have, we want to know immediately, and we will make sure that those folks are not creating any issues. And they've also wanted to look at our observation checklist, and that was really great. That process has been good. All of that communication with county clerks and the Secretary of State, I think, has been wonderful. And as the election goes on, I imagine that problems will arise, but the communication has been good enough that I feel like we can resolve any issues that arise. We will continue to provide training to observers. We will continue to check in with observers. We will ultimately end up with hundreds of people in polling places around New Mexico who are observing elections. And we have been invited by county clerks and the Secretary of State to present in various places about what we're doing. And we're really excited about this new move in New Mexico and in Montana and in Georgia, and in a previous election in Arizona, toward nonpartisan election observation as a standard way of conducting observation of the process, and not just observation on behalf of particular sets of voters. We are unique in that we are genuinely looking at the whole process, and can report back and provide useful data to county clerks and the Secretary of State about variation in practice throughout the state, and also about similarity in practice throughout the state. I'm interested to hear what questions people have about that process, and about the shift that will occur from simply utilizing partisan or interest-based observers who are advocating on behalf of voters, and shifting, I think, in the next several decades toward what has been accepted more internationally, which is really looking at the process rather than engaging in voter advocacy within the polling place. I think that each of those practices have an important role in the election. And I would elevate the importance of partisan and interest-based advocacy. But I would also elevate the importance of the role of looking at the process as a whole. Thank you.
That's excellent, Carmen. We'll actually have an opportunity for questions toward the end. I'm going to take a quick opportunity to share, I think, some resources that the elections group has put together over the last few years. They'll be in the chat, and I think we're going to put them on the screen, but otherwise I will just go ahead and keep talking. One of the things that you'll hear the folks at the elections group talk about is the concept of meaningful observation. The gist of that is that it means it's observation where a person who is observing, a person who is watching the process, can have a meaningful understanding of what's going on, report back, and not in any way not be able to do that essentially. Obviously, with 50 different states that have 50 different ways of providing for observation, that looks different everywhere. I would say generally our ethos, or the thing that we espouse, is if you are on one side of the fence or the other, it's generally to provide a little bit more of an opportunity for observation than not providing opportunity for observation. But that is certainly 100% dependent on the context of how you're administering elections, what your state law allows for. Obviously, very importantly, what your state law allows for. You can't go beyond that. But I'll talk a little bit about just two or three of our different things that we've done. The first of which is our election process template. We really believe that meaningful observation is only possible when folks understand what is supposed to be happening within a given area of an election process. So if they're watching the process for processing vote by mail ballots as they return to an office, if folks don't have a way of understanding what's supposed to happen, they can't provide meaningful observation. And in some cases, it could become there could be opportunities for misinformation that arise from that. So simply providing the information very directly to observers and to other folks on this is what you should expect to see, this is what you will see. If you have instances where you're not seeing this, please reach out to us. Let's have a conversation so we can either explain those deviations or we can address them with our team. So you'll see on the screen, there's several different processes that we're looking at. Canvassing electronic poll books, for the process of checking in voters at electronic poll books, the dissemination of election results, mail ballot processing. All of these are extremely important and technical in many cases aspects of the election process. And what we've done here is create very generic sets of information that hopefully election officials from across the country, understanding what happens in their state, they can take this as a starting point, make adjustments, put their own branding on it, and then share it with their observers and with other folks. So sharing those on the screen, it's in the chat, it'll be in the follow-up email. But I do encourage folks, if you have any questions on that, reach out, because we're also able to, in many places, make adjustments to them for you or on your behalf. And we'll move on to the next resource. Shared expectations for meaningful observation. This was born out of kind of an implicit understanding that if you're going to expect something of someone else, and we're talking about, we're all former election officials at the elections group, so we're talking about it from the perspective of an election official. If you're going to expect something from someone else, it is only right to show them what they should expect from you. So you'll see on the left side of this what observers can expect and what election officials should strive to provide, what election officials can expect. And that includes, looking back at Jasmine's work, the ability to do one's work without obstruction, and how observers should consider providing for that in those contexts. Again, this is just like everything else that we do, or many of the other things that we do, in that we hope offices take this information, make it work for your office, use it, share it. We want to see, but the whole idea is that implicit understanding that if you're going to put expectations on someone else, let them know what you're doing to provide for that. Let them know what they should be able to expect from you. And then I think we have, just a few more examples of that work. Again, the larger ethos of meaningful observation, allowing folks to see what's going on, making sure that they have an understanding of what's going on, what they can expect from you, what you should reasonably be able to expect from them. That's everything that we're pointing to. Understanding fully that there are lots of different ways that these processes play out. Lots of different things at play in terms of who is allowed to observe, when they're allowed to observe, and so on. So I just want to underscore these are generic templates that folks are meant to take and make their own that works for their context. We had a resource workshop similar to this, I think, almost 2 years ago now, or maybe it was last year, with Lane County, Oregon, and I think Orange County, California, two offices that over the last few years have done a ton at engaging observers, making sure that folks are able to understand processes or that information is available about processes. So we'll also put this for folks to watch if you're interested at some practical applications of meaningful observation. So I think we're going to move on to questions if folks are ready. So I think we've all touched on this, but I do want to just ask again, why, and maybe we'll look at Carmen, why as a citizen is observation important? So not as an election official, not as someone who's partisan in some way. Why is it important to have that or have the ability to watch these processes?
Sure. So I think that there's a really important public education component that's part of observation more broadly. It's an opportunity to civically engage, and for different reasons when you're observing for the party than when you're observing for a group of voters. And again, a different reason when you're acting as a nonpartisan observer. But it's an opportunity to become civically engaged. And I especially love the nonpartisan election observation process because you're watching the whole system and you learn a lot. So as we roll out PSAs all over the state of New Mexico, and as we conduct trainings for hundreds of people, all of those people are learning about all of the complex processes that county clerks and the Secretary of State undertake in order to put an election on. I would say that for most of the folks that we have trained, it has been a humbling process to understand how complex elections are. And so there's an education component. And then secondly, there's a civic engagement component. And third, there is lots of international evidence that nonpartisan election observation increases the transparency and the trust in elections, even when they're run mostly well. And in the US, most of our elections are run really well. And so I think that it is a really important opportunity in the US to increase people's sense of trust in elections by providing a higher level of transparency and a higher level of public education.
That's excellent. I don't know if Jasleen or Roki want to add on at all to that piece or that answer.
I'll just jump in and just talk. As Carmen says, it's the importance of getting the citizens engaged in the process and building transparency. The education of what it takes to be an election official is enormous, and often the media doesn't have the opportunity to actually convey it. People don't understand just the logistics it takes to put on an election. And if we have some credible observers in the field working with elections administrators to show this and detail all of the effort and show that it's being run, well, and that there shouldn't be a concern with the actual administration of the election. It's a great thing. I mean, the last decade has seen a serious erosion of elections trust. And partisan poll watchers, although they have valid reasons for existence and are necessary to the process, often confuse the process to their own agendas. So what we want to do is build, like I said, cross-partisan relationships for folks to regain the trust in the elections atmosphere, and also work with elections officials so that elections officials don't distrust the process. As Carmen was saying earlier about working with the elections officials and showing them the checklists and everything else, we've gotten some feedback from our folks in Montana that let us know, well, this doesn't happen in this county. We designed our forms for a statewide level, and now we're going through an adjustment because they're afraid that if if we ask this particular question, that it would reflect poorly on their election administration because they don't do that process. So we're working with them to learn how they're administering things and then how we're doing things. And we think overall it's gonna provide a very beneficial process for the citizens of Montana.
That's excellent. Jesseline, do you have anything to add?
No, I think my co-presenters have covered it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I really like the point you made, Roki, about the two-way street, right? Like election officials working with observers, observers working with election officials, making sure that folks kind of come in with a shared understanding of where things are. And to your point, I mean, I think any election official on the call would agree that the undertaking of doing this and doing this well, and I'm talking about creating a checklist that works for every jurisdiction, is an enormous undertaking. I do see in the Q&A a note from Wendy about gotcha observers, so folks who are coming in kind of with a preconceived notion of what they want to see. I would say that our work at the elections group doesn't necessarily focus on those folks. We're focusing on well-intentioned observers, folks who want to understand the process and want to have an independent understanding, an independent idea of what's happening. But I do think, kind of jumping into a question, Jesseline, I think your work touches on those folks a little bit. And I don't know if you just want to explore how election officials may be able to take your resources and use them in a way that is effective for managing that, small aspect of this really big process.
Yeah, and I mean I do want to recognize, and Roki definitely touched on this, but the election denial movement that we saw after the 2020 election and the thought that the 2020 election was stolen, it has led to harassment and death threats against election officials. And I want to recognize that very real consequence of what we saw in 2020 and its aftermath. And that has sown a lot of distrust in our elections processes. So I think it's very real. It's a very real possibility that there may be folks coming into polling sites with a sort of bad faith. And I think the best thing that election officials and election workers can have on their side, and I know some of us have talked about it, is to really know what the parameters are in your state, in your county, if there's specific county guidance or something that's additional that your county elections board has put out to help you make calls. But really know what the parameters are so that someone who's coming in maybe trying to find something that doesn't exist, or having heard like, oh, I heard this was going on, or these voting machines have issues, whatever is being spewed that's not the reality. It's on, like, election workers on the ground. They're the backbone of our elections. They're the backbone of our democracy. But it's also unfortunately on them to know exactly what the rules are, to make sure that there is a backstop to someone who may be coming in with not the best intentions, with not the curiosity, with not the desire to be educated about the process. And it's on election workers to sort of know what the rules are and push back and use the resources that they have at their disposal, and know that they can remove folks who are disrupting their elections process. They can call upon law enforcement if needed, to deal with someone who's disrupting the election.
And to add on just a little bit, I would encourage election officials, we're almost 5 weeks out from the general election date. I encourage folks to begin having those conversations if you haven't already, and I'm sure most folks have, having those conversations with law enforcement so that they also have a shared understanding of what's going on during these processes. And you can, call upon them if you need to. Hopefully, in most places, you will not need to, and that's awesome. But that doesn't mean that folks shouldn't be making preparations for doing so, for when it does become necessary, unfortunately. I want to. I think everybody can answer this question, but I kind of want to get into the mind of someone who's doing observation. So looking at Roki, who I know as a former election official has done international observation trips, obviously looking at Carmen, who's co-leading this excellent effort in New Mexico. as an observer, what are some things that you keep in mind when you're trying to meaningfully observe any type of election process? Are there like top line notes that you would give to someone who's going and doing this for the first time?
Yeah, we provide, oh, I'm sorry, Roki, go
No, no,
ahead.
Carmen, go, please.
Okay. So, we do 2 levels of training with all of our observers. So one is about the law, and our checklists and our guidance all follow state law. And then there is the conversation about what your orientation is as you walk into the county clerk's office or the election official's office or the polling place, and what their role is and what their orientation is. That training is really important. And I think that the communication with the election officials is also really important. We are very explicit with our observers that if they see things happening in the polling place that they disagree with, it is not their job to intervene. It is not their job to tell election officials what state law is. It is not their job to stand up for voters. It is not their job to challenge registrations. That any engagement at all is in fact inappropriate. And when they see problems, we ask them to step outside of the polling place and call us if they feel like it's extreme. That is not the case with partisan observers. They have different sets of instructions from their parties, from their county parties, their state parties, and the national parties. So I think it behooves election officials to either have laws or to set criteria that provides them with the ability to manage observers in whatever form they take. Because I've done a tremendous amount of partisan observation as well, and over the years, and partisan observers are empowered to stand up and challenge registration, challenge voters. That is not a practice in New Mexico, but they are in fact able to do that. And if county clerks, Secretary of State, and other election officials do not set boundaries around what kind of behavior is allowed, it can become very problematic, as we've seen in many places. And election officials are in charge of their stations, and observers are observers. And so I think county clerks being able to assert the authority that they have and maintain order and make sure that the efficacy of the polling places is preserved is really important. The first order of business is people being able to vote, and everything else is secondary.
And then if I can add that I have 2 different experiences regarding elections administration or observation, one as an observer, one as an administrator. And as an observer, my background as an elections administrator brings a different dynamic than any other observers, because I can see things through the lens of elections administration, and where somebody may see an absolutely chaotic situation, I may see organized chaos, because I know what the folks are going through when all of the materials are coming in and they're trying to organize the ballots and those types of things. So it helps bring some context to observation. And then as an elections administrator, the one thing I really liked about election observation is the ability to know what I don't know. I enjoyed working with the elections observers and understanding their context in how they were going to be observing things. And then getting their reports later on. Sometimes there may be an issue in a polling location where the machines aren't set up in a way that is conducive to crowd flows. And sometimes our poll workers aren't reliable narrators when they're telling us things that happened at the elections at the precinct level. So it's nice to have this information, one, to validate all of the work that the staff has done throughout the process. It validates all of the hard work that everybody has put in for the 6 or 7 months prior to the election, that it has been run well. And it also, as an administrator, may highlight some deficiencies that I can't see from my chair in my office on election day, that I have these trusted eyes who I've worked with during the process to understand where they're coming from and then get their data and then fine tune some things. So I really think it's a beneficial process for both folks. Elections administrators can benefit from learning what's going on, and then the nonpartisan observers benefit from learning about elections administration and then transmitting that knowledge to everybody else and helping the media understand everything. And overall, it's only going to strengthen the process.
That's excellent. I see we have a question in the chat, which I'm going to paraphrase. There's a state that has. So let me think of how to ask this question. In terms of the Carter Center's work in New Mexico and in Montana, it seems like you have been able to get widespread buy-in at both the state and local level on the work that's being done, on the procedures and the training that's taking place. What is the roadmap for other organizations to do the same thing and to work as closely with election officials or work alongside election officials, both at the state and local level, with the understanding that these nonpartisan observers are simply attempting to provide verification for the process to increase trust? What would your advice be to someone either just starting or attempting to do this and hitting roadblock? Again, I just want to underline 50 different states, 50 different ways of doing things, and within each of those states, different understandings of how things should be done. And obviously that's a breeding ground for misunderstanding. So we'll go to Roki first, I think, on just what is that roadmap?
Well, the first thing is engaging very early in the process. Election observation is not something that happens 35 days out. You know, it's a process where citizens should organize well in advance of the election, sometimes 6 months, 7 months out. It takes some resources as well. So you're going to have to identify your methodology, how you're going to do things, and what you're going to need to conduct an election. If you're going to conduct it at a county level, you know, it may be okay. If you're doing it at a state level, and I'll let Carmen detail how they're working it as a state level, it takes significant resources to gather all of the data as it's coming in through the state and analyze it and process everything. But the key is to begin before you really think about it. You have to think about it. It would be, if you wanted to start this process for 2026, you would want to start engaging in late 25, early 26 to begin the process of recruiting and understanding what is going on and learning from other observation missions that have been out there, and thinking about the process. It's not something that you can stand up as an amateur in 35 to 50 days and really be productive. You are going to want to build that relationship with the election administrators, so that you can see the process and understand that we're not just monitoring election day. We want to monitor the entire process. Some states early voting, Virginia, it starts 45 days out. So if you want to really observe, you're going to have to start your process 60 to 70 days out. So it's getting people to think about it, finding the resources that you can utilize, and then begin the process. Carmen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from the perspective of election officials, I think codifying the process that you want to see in your state is important. So providing standing to the sets of observers that you want to have standing, and providing them with roles, responsibilities, and guardrails consistent with your ability to effectively manage all of the election processes. So if you always want observers for your poll worker trainings to be in a corner and not be in the front, then, you know, say that the local election officials have the right to, you know, segregate observers, but also provide the right in law for observers to be able to observe the process. So I think codifying a lot of that in advance is helpful. You know, what authority and flexibility you want election officials to have, and what roles and responsibilities you want observers from both partisan observers, and then observers representing constituency groups, and then nonpartisan system observers.
That's excellent. I think just one other thing that I would perhaps consider is the value of partnerships, and the value, obviously, too, of relationships. However big your state is, whether it's 15 counties or 100 counties, that's 100 or 15 different personalities of election administrators or chief election officials that you're dealing with. And I think breaking through is sometimes as easy as having a relationship, or at least having someone who has a relationship with those folks, so you can begin the conversation. Um, not to say that that is always going to be 100% successful. This is obviously not a perfect process. So I just wanted to add that additionally. I think we're getting toward the end. I think we see one more question in the chat, which is to the folks at the Carter Center. Does your observer checklist differ from the observer manuals that some counties have prepared? Does your presentation or information differ? And what's your process for perhaps bridging those two things? Oh, you're muted, Roki.
Yep, sorry. I'm going to say that, yeah, it does differ because, each state has a different process, and we're also tailoring it to the different election apparatus in each different state. And in some states, that apparatus may be different within each individual county, different voting equipments, whether they have electronic poll books, paper poll books. There's all kinds of different procedures that they may do. So that's, again, one of the reasons why you want to start early so you can meet with the elections officials and understand what's going on in your state or your county. And then also take the toolkits that we're developing. Carter Center is going to be releasing several toolkits after this year, early first quarter next year, for nonpartisan observers. We're taking all the lessons learned that we've had from our international missions and our local missions, our pilots that we've done this year, and creating a toolkit to hand off that is a toolkit that you can use as a skeleton to build out. These are the kind of questions that you're going to want to ask, but you're going to have to format them in a way that is valuable to get information, in your specific jurisdiction. So yeah, everything does differ. And as I said earlier, in Montana, we first designed the forms based on our observation efforts in Missoula County. And then we're moving on to some of the smaller counties, and they're like, we don't have this process. We don't do it this way. And so if you say no on this form that this wasn't done, it's going to reflect badly on us. And we're like, no, it's not. And we understand that give and take. So we're going to create our forms to represent what is going on in some of the smaller counties as well. So yeah, it's a roundabout way to say that everything is created at the hyper local level, build using the toolkits that we're trying to build out that's as generalized as possible.
Carmen, anything to add? I feel like Roki covered down on. All right, excellent. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. One of the organizations that we work with uses it's mindset, skill set, tool set. I hope that through this conversation, the folks in the audience, or the folks who are participating, have gotten something that shows that this is a real effort to shift, in some cases, folks' mindset about observation, make it a more welcoming and collaborative relationship between both observers and election officials. Obviously, on the tool set and the skill set piece, whether it's the excellent work from the Brennan Center, the forthcoming resources from the Carter Center, some of the stuff that we've done, I hope folks will be able to take that and use it. But I do want to provide just a minute to each of our participants or each of our panelists to go ahead and close us out with a bang. So I'll start with Jasleen. Go ahead.
Thanks. I would just encourage election officials to acknowledge and encourage lawful observation. Folks want transparency. This is a meaningful way to do that. But to do it in a way where everyone knows the rules. There's a line between observation and disruption. And so both election officials and folks who are going in to observe go in knowing the law and knowing the policies.
All right, Carmen.
I would just say thank you for your work. Thank you for facilitating the voting of people across this country, and we look forward to working with you.
Roki?
Yeah, I just want to say to, elections administrators out there, to not fear the process. It's a good thing. Enjoy it, learn from it, and also teach with it. It's an education process for you, and it's an education process for the people that are doing it. And it's a way to get your message out in a format that is trusted, that may not otherwise get out.
That's excellent. Well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who was able to come on. We have another webinar on this same topic next week, not last week. Next week, which we hope you'll be able to join, and we hope as we get our thank you email out to you that you'll be able to take advantage of the resources that we've talked about today. Thank you. Have a great one, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.